So the past few weeks, we've been hanging out in the book of Psalm. We've been talking a lot about worship. And with this being Thanksgiving week, gratitude is definitely a recurring theme in the Psalms. But I know we kind of think like, you know, your kids are in school and some were probably dressed up like pilgrims this week and some were dressed up like Native Americans and thinking about their very first ever Thanksgiving, but it actually goes way further than the colonial days, goes all the way back to ancient Israel where they would do some Thanksgiving feasts as well. And so it gets mentioned in the book of Psalms chapter 50 where we'll be hanging out. So if you want to go ahead and turn your Bibles over there, I want to share with you one of my most memorable Thanksgiving feasts ever in the Castleberry house. As many of you know, I love cooking on my egg-style grill. It's a Kamado Joe, and these things get incredibly hot if you're not watching them. And my first time ever smoking a turkey on it, something interesting happened. Here's a little selfie. That's not sawdust like I thought it was for a second there. That is burnt hair. We can zoom in a little bit and you can kind of see. That happened because I opened my grill too quickly the Thanksgiving of 2016 when we first got that grill. You're supposed to burp those things because it kind of lets the heat go out the side first. You open it too quickly, whoosh. So I guess I moved my hairline back a little bit that Thanksgiving. But here's kind of, I love smoking meat. It's a big deal. But this year, I'm 2 years into a new Thanksgiving tradition, and I'm going to see if this is controversial or not. Like, how many of you feel like it's not Thanksgiving without turkey? That's a pretty big deal, right? Yeah, I get it. It's traditional. I just feel like turkey takes a crazy amount of work and prep and injection and seasoning and brining to just taste okay. Right? I mean, let's be honest. Have you had a turkey where you're just like, oh my gosh, like I've never had turkey that I've liked more than just chicken. So I have committed in our household, I'm doing prime rib every Thanksgiving. So you're more of a red meat guy too down front. I like that. But the reason I'm bringing this up because it's actually kind of biblical. Because in the Old Testament, they had these things known as offerings of thanks, and it involved prime rib. It involved red meat. And there's all these instructions for the way these ceremonial sacrifices were supposed to take place for a thanks offering in ancient Israel. And here's theological proof that a ribeye marbled fatty cut is a better piece of meat than a nice lean fillet. Because if you look at the instructions that God gave the priests that are kind of overseeing this whole burnt offering sacrificial system, God is like, leave the fatty parts for me. So I don't know if I don't know what your cut of steak is, but theologically, ribeye is a superior cut. That's the cut that God wanted for himself in these sacrifices. So I want to give you just a little bit of biblical history to understand what we're going to be talking about in Psalm chapter 50, because it's instructions for an offering of thanks, which is different than the ritualistic, ceremonial offerings of like sin and guilt. So there was two different categories, and we want to make sure that we understand what we're talking about, because we're going to talk about these burnt offerings in a minute, but specifically offerings of thanks were not something that were done out of religious obligation to appease God. Now, the sin and the guilt offerings were things that had to be done in order for the forgiveness of sins to be granted. Atonement would take place. People would bring some of their lamb or goat or a bull, and they would kind of butcher it up. And the priest would offer this sacrifice, and that was something that they were expected to do. It was a requirement. But an offering of thanks would look very similar to a sin offering. A lot of the same ingredients getting brought up to this altar to get roasted before the Lord. But an offering of thanks was something that was 100% voluntary. An offering of thanks, or other translations call it a free will offering, because this was something that was optional, versus the sin offering was 100% required if you wanted to be in a right standing relationship with the Lord. And so what we're going to see here in these next few moments is that the offerings of thanks, because they were out of your own free will, because they were out of your own volition, it was your option to choose to partake in an offering of thanks, actually brought a great delight to God. God didn't delight in the burnt offerings for sin because that was kind of like the baseline. What he delighted is when people wanted to express their gratitude, their thankfulness for who God is. So if you're in ancient Israel, coming up to the temple for the day of sacrifice, from the outside looking in, you and I would probably not know the difference between a family who is coming to present a sin offering versus a family who is coming to present a thanks offering. Because externally, it looks very similar. But what's happening on the inside is very different in the person who is going through the motions and presenting a guilt offering as compared to somebody who is there because they want to be, not because they feel like they have to be. I think the same thing is true about church thousands of years later. You know, we don't have eyes to see into each other's hearts and know motive. So I don't know who is coming because they feel like this is what you got to do to keep God happy versus who is coming because this is genuinely something that they want to do to express their love for the Lord and their love for his people. Looks very similar on the outside, but what's happening on the inside comes from a very different place. And if you find yourself on more the obligatory side of Christianity, it often leads to us thinking that we are doing this to help God out, or I'm coming to this church plant to help it grow, or I'm giving to this church plant to help fund the mission, or I'm serving to help reach people. And while all those things are true, what we have to remember is that God doesn't need any of us. God doesn't need anything from us. God doesn't need me to be the preacher of this church for this church to grow. God is going to accomplish his purposes whether we are in on it or not. And so we have to really put our offerings and our gifts and our involvement in church in a proper category. We're not doing this because God needs our help. If he needed our help, then he wouldn't be God. God is 100% self-sufficient. Jesus said that I will build my church and not even the gates of hell will prevail against it. We have got the pleasure of knowing the way the story ends, and it ends with Jesus reigning supreme for eternity. He doesn't need our help, but guess what? He wants our heart. And that's the difference between the religious obligations of showing up because we think this is what God expects of us versus recognizing that God is 100% content. God is existing in this loving relationship with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and all the angels telling him how amazing he is. God doesn't need anything from us, but there is something that God wants for us. And the people who would engage in these voluntary offerings of thanks understood that. That God doesn't need our help. He just wants our heart. And that looks different according to the season of life that we are in. For some of us, that's going to be a journey in generosity and learning how to trust God with our finances. For some of us, it's going to look like learning how to share our faith with our neighbor. For some of us, it's going to be showing up consistently at church. For some of us, it's going to be showing up consistently in our walk with God. Like, we all have to figure out what the Holy Spirit wants for us in our next steps of obedience. But what puts a smile on the heart of God is not us doing this out of obligation. What puts a smile on the heart of God is us doing this because we want to, not because we feel like we have to. So Psalms chapter 50 has a lot to say about the difference between religious obligation and the relational opportunity that we have to show God how thankful we are for who he is and what he's done. In Psalm 50, verse 7, it says this: "Listen, my people, and I will speak. I will testify against you, Israel. I am God, your God. I bring no charges against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offerings, which are ever before me. I have no need of a bull from your stall or goats from your pens, for every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains and every insect in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Sacrifice thank offerings to God, fulfill your vows to the Most High, and call on me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you will honor me. The psalmist here is basically reminding us that God didn't set up this religious system of bringing our livestock as offerings because God was lacking. He's saying here that I know where every animal is on planet Earth. And I am God, and I'm not lacking anything. I didn't ask for these sacrifices because I need your help. Have you ever tried shopping for somebody who you feel like they've got everything? You ever tried shopping for somebody who feels like, man, what can I get this person that will help them out? Like you try to find a gift for a rich person, and you're like, well, they've probably got like the Louis Vuitton Mercedes version of whatever it is that I'm going to get them. And so God isn't looking for these gifts, these offerings, these sacrifices because he needs our help in executing his plan and his design. He doesn't need our help in his will being accomplished. I want you to think about it like this. A few weeks ago, my daughter Adelaide had about a week-long cold, and she was totally helpless. Everything that she needed was being supplied by her mother and I, mostly her mother, right? They think she's just incredible, and she is. But at the end of the week, Adelaide knew that Erica did more for her than I did. So Adelaide is trying to think, this was a beautiful little moment, something you really take delight in, seeing your kids begin to think this way. She wanted to show her appreciation for what Erica had done for her this week. Now she's a 5-year-old. She's got a little piggy bank, but there's no gift that she could give Erica that would help Erica be a better parent. There's no gift that she could give Erica that would help Erica take better care of things around the house. So she was just going to do something personal from the heart. So she found one of her coloring books and decided to color in this little picture. And it's fine, it's not going to win an art show anywhere. Didn't really even stay in the lines, but she added a bunch of her own hearts, and she's still trying to write her name. So she kind of scribbled her name in there. And she came over to me and she's like, asked me to help her kind of pull this thing from the coloring book so she didn't rip it up. And then she just kind of sheepishly walked over to Erica and said, hey, I colored this for you. Thanks for taking good care of me. You're the best mom. And all of our hearts were just melted right then and there. It was such a beautiful moment because that wasn't something that was expected. That wasn't something that was obligatory. We don't take care of her hoping that she will show gratitude for the amazing parents that we're trying to be, right? But in that moment, her own free will, she just found what was at her disposal and decided to bring something, not that was helpful to Erica, but something that was heartfelt. And that's still, to this day, several months later, hanging on our fridge because of how beautiful and how powerful that was and what it did for us as her parents. Now, don't get me wrong. There are things in our household that our kids have to do, right? There are rules that our rules, you are obligated to be in compliance with these things, right? Like bedtime and, hey, you eat what we eat or you don't eat, right? We all have house rules. Like in this house, they're known as the 10 Commandments. Like we are obligated to not kill somebody. We are obligated to be truth tellers. We are obligated to not take the Lord's name in vain. There are parts of our faith that are obligational. But here's how I would reframe this whole thing. We obey God with our obligations, but we honor God with our options. That's what's happening here in these offerings of thanks. This was an optional thing to do, where they might bring a whole bull from their livestock, from their pen, and bring that to the priest, and he would sacrifice that, and they would experience atonement for their sins. That's obligatory. That's an obedience issue. But the offering of thanks, the free will offering, was optional. And what God is saying here is, I don't need your sacrifices to keep me happy. I don't need your obligations to satisfy me. I just want your heart. And the way we know if God has our heart is if we're looking at the optional things. The things in our margin, the things that we've got surplus. That's what really moves the heart of God. And so what I want to do here is we unpack this idea of a thanksgiving offering is maybe compare and contrast obligational faith and optional faith. The things that we are obligated to do versus the things that are up to us. And I think what you're going to see is there's a version of Christianity that it's really easy to just go through the motions. There's a version of Christianity where we show up because it kind of feels like that's what you do in the South. There's an obligatory version of this, and that's not what I want for our church. I want us to see this as something that not too long ago, when the lockdowns were happening, we realized how special it is to gather in this capacity. Like, we're not too far removed from 2020 and the lockdowns. It's close enough in recent history where this should still feel like a privilege. So as we are entering the week of Thanksgiving and we're thinking about all the things that are happening in our life that we've got to give thanks to God for, I want you to put yourself back in the shoes of ancient Israel, where somebody who had already done the bare minimum, they've gone before the priest and they've offered their sacrifice to get things right with God. They've checked the box for obedience. The obligations have been met religiously. And then they're going to take the same amount of livestock that they just did out of obligation, and now they're going to optionally pull from their resources, for some of them their livelihood, and bring that back the next day. And here's what's beautiful about these offerings of thanks. They would bring this animal. It'd be slaughtered, butchered, put on the altar, and it gets cooked. The priest would take their cut, and they would actually eat the meat. And then whatever the priest didn't want, they would send back to you for you then to consume with your friends and with your family, which is a very different experience than the offerings of sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. See, this optional free will offering was something that didn't just benefit you and bless God. It was something that also blessed your neighbors and the people who were maybe pilgriming with you to the temple in Jerusalem. And so I think what we begin to see is when we choose to not just maintain the status quo of Christianity, we're going to realize how your faith is not just a blessing to God and purposeful and enriching for you, but out of the overflow of our options and our generosity and our free will, the people in our life, in our community, sharing cubicles with you, the people in your spheres of influence are meant to be blessed by what's happening in the overflow of your Christianity as well. So let's take a look at optional faith versus obligatory, obligational faith. You know the difference when you see somebody who is dutiful instead of worshipful. Someone who is dutiful is really just looking to do the bare minimums. Like, just tell me what's expected of me. I'll be there. I'll be dependable. And I hope as we think about this spiritually, we start also seeing some like day-to-day practical implications of this as well. Because I think we all know somebody in our workplace or in our family or in our friendship circle who is just kind of maintaining the bare minimum of just what are my responsibilities, just tell me what's expected of me. That person in the workplace takes really long bathroom breaks, right? That person in the workplace is doing just enough to not get fired. That person in the workplace is just trying to step up to the duties and never wants to go above and beyond. They show up just in time to not be considered late. And they never stay over to try to make sure that things get done on time. Just tell me what's expected, and I'll be there, which is fine, but dutiful is not worshipful. Remember, there are some things that God expects out of us, right? Just because we believe that we're in a covenant of grace doesn't mean that we get to ignore the 10 Commandments. But Christianity is so much more than trying to check the boxes. Following God is not something that's supposed to be done out of a sense of duty or responsibility. When it's worshipful instead of dutiful, it means that we are looking for opportunities to put a smile on God's face. It means that we're looking for opportunities to let him know and let our neighbors know how good God is. Obligational faith is compared to optional faith. It moves from dutiful to worshipful, but it also moves from got to instead of get to. We begin to see Sunday mornings. We begin to see Bible study. We begin to see learning our spiritual gifts. We begin to see opportunities to share our testimony with our friends who are far from God. It's not something that's just expected of us, but something that we get to do. We begin to see this as a privilege. We begin to see it as an honor that God would look at you and I and extend the hand of partnership. We start realizing, while God doesn't need us to accomplish his purposes, he wants us on his team. And he's created opportunities that look a lot like problems. He's created opportunities that look a lot like disappointment. He's created a lot of opportunities that look a lot like drama, that look a lot like adversity, where your spiritual gifts, where your passion for the Lord, where your availability, where your willingness to show up, where your willingness to speak up might be the catalyst in somebody's life that would let them realize who God is. But if we're just maintaining the status quo, if we're just trying to do the bare minimum to keep God happy, not get fired, then we're never going to experience the difference between get to and got to Christianity. And I might be preaching to the choir a little bit with a group of people who showed up on Thanksgiving week when there's probably all kinds of things that you got to get ready to do, and there's no kids ministry happening this week. But what I'm going to ask you guys to do as people who are here on a holiday weekend is when we gear up for the Christmas run and we start publicizing Christmas Eve and people start looking for what church they're going to go to, that you would see this as a get to, not a got to. And you would see the people in your neighborhood who are far from God and see the spiritual conversations as a get to, not a got to, and start talking to them about what God is doing in your life. Start talking to them about what God is doing in your church. And just maybe that moment is a divine appointment where you maybe hand them an invite card or show them our church's social media and they show up. And this Christmas is what changes their life. It's a get to. It's not a got to. And then finally, obligational Christianity, obligational faith is compared to optional faith that goes from just trying to appease to understanding what's pleasing. Now, let me just tell you this. The scripture tells us that the wrath of God against our sin was dealt with on the cross. So God is not mad at you. God is not disappointed in you. God is not upset or surprised when we mess up. And when we realize what he has done for us, when we realize how significant it was that the God of the universe stepped out of heaven onto earth, went from sitting on a throne to making chairs for people as the son of a carpenter. When we realize all that he has done just to purchase a relationship with you and I, to end the battle over sin and death, we should just let this rest on you, that you are not responsible for appeasing God. You don't give to your church. You don't share your testimony. You don't volunteer at your church. You don't do Christian things to appease God. You realize that he is already pleased with you if you have named Jesus the Lord of your life. And out of that recognition that he takes great delight just in your existence, not in your religion, our natural response should be to do pleasing things. Not to appease him, but because he is pleased with you. Not because he needs your money, not because he needs your help, but because he has given you a unique story. He's given you unique passions. He has given you a local church family. He's given us a community with problems that need to be solved. He has given you and I everything we need to live a meaningful life. We just have to look at our options and steward our options in a way that show our gratitude for all that he's done for us. When we first moved to Georgia about 7 years ago, Eric and I lived in Las Vegas before here. We spent about 2 years working at a really great church out there. And then at the time it was called Mountain Lake Church over in Cumming, brought us in to be a part of the team. And it was a really pretty quick process there between Christmas and February. Christmas of 2014, February 22nd of 2015 is when we were here. And we hired this moving company, and full disclosure, somebody told me not to use this moving company, but I was being a cheapskate, and I said, I'm gonna roll the dice. They didn't get the best reviews from people, but they'll get it there. And in the winter, when that moving van was going from Las Vegas, somehow had to go through the Midwest, the moving company lost touch with the moving van. And so Erica and I, with a 4-month-old baby, are sleeping on air mattresses for a couple of weeks, wondering where our stuff is. We're in a new town with no friends, figuring out, man, what is this new life going to look like? And when our stuff finally got there, we found out that the neighborhood we were living in at the time, the grade of the street was too steep for the moving van to get into. So I had to rent a U-Haul, meet the moving van in the Publix parking lot, unload the stuff out of the moving van into the U-Haul, and then try to figure out how to get all that stuff into our house. We didn't know anybody. Somebody in the church heard about it, and they were in a similar situation just a few years before. And because somebody in their church offered to help them out, they kind of made a commitment that anytime they hear about somebody in their church that needs help moving, they're going to show up. It was a predetermined decision that they made that the answer would be yes anytime that sort of need presented itself. They didn't have to. They weren't obligated to do it. And I would have never known that this was an option for them. They just showed up. But because they determined ahead of time that this is who we want to be. People who look at our discretionary time, people who look at our discretionary income, who look at our discretionary resources, like that is what honors God, the discretionary parts of our life. That's why God delighted in a offering of thanks, because it was their choice to worship. It was their choice to be generous. It was their choice to recognize how good the Lord is. And so my heart for us as a church family, as we're about to do all the things and have all the festivities and we're entering the holiday season, there's going to be a lot of things that are fighting for our time. There's going to be a lot of things that are fighting for our attention. And we're going to have to kind of build our schedule and build our priorities. And my hope is as we're kind of figuring things out, as we're building our shopping list and figuring out which Christmas parties we're going to say yes to, which ones we're going to say no to, that we would revisit a heart that honors God and say, what do I have discretion over? What is optional in my life? And how can I leverage those options to honor Him? And it's, as you start thinking and start praying, you start planning, I think the Holy Spirit is going to show up and do what only he can do and identify what those areas of obedience look like, what those opportunities look like. He's going to start putting names of people in your life that need to hear from you. He's going to cause you to maybe notice something with maybe some of our nonprofits that need some help. And what if we right now could choose, could predetermine a yes? God, however you nudge me, however you guide me this season, I'm going to make decisions and I'm going to structure my life in a way that honors you. No more religious obligations, but a heart that sees the opportunity to express gratitude and to live a life that honors him and blesses others. That's what this season is all about.